Network Services Part 1. In this nugget, we're going to start talking about network services on your Linux system. A network service is a service like FTP, which we talked about in the last nugget. But that time, though, we just looked at how to use an FTP client to gain access to some other site. In this nugget, we're going to look at it from the server side of things. We're going to learn how to configure an FTP server, and then once we do that, we'll look at the Internet Super Server, which is called XINETD, spelled XINETD. This is a server that can manage a number of different servers like FTP, Telnet, and so on. So what we're going to do first is we're going to configure an FTP server in standalone mode, and then we'll learn how to configure the FTP server so that it runs under the Internet Super Server XINETD. Let's get to work. Well, the first thing I want to do in this nugget is I want to show you how to get an FTP server up and running. Now, there's lots of FTP servers out there. There's Pro FTP, which is the one that we're going to set up here. There's VSFTP, which stands for Very Secure FTP. There's WU FTP, WU FTP, and that was built at Washington University. They're probably the three most popular ones. Some people complain about the security of various FTP programs, like WU FTP got a bad rap for some security problems and things like that. Ultimately, all FTP servers are a little bit insecure, especially if you're typing usernames and passwords to make people get into your FTP server. All that stuff is traveling over the internet in an unencrypted fashion, and so ultimately, anything that's like the FTP protocol is just, ultimately a little bit insecure. And so, if you need to have secure access between machines, you should be using like the secure shell and all the variants of that, to do your transfers. Okay, but FTP still holds an important place in the Linux community, so I want to show you how to get an FTP server up and running. All right, so like I said, I've chosen to upload and use Pro FTPD. The D on the end just stands for daemon. Okay, first we're going to run this, get this FTP server up in what's called standalone mode. So we'll just start it up, and then people will be able to get on our FTP server, whenever they want. And then the other way that we're going to do it is we're going to run it through an internet super daemon, like a XINETD. All right, and so XINETD will sort of stand there, and when it gets an FTP request, then it'll start up the FTP server on, for that request, and then it just saves resources. Okay, so that's a good way to save resources, is that XINETD manage a lot of these kind of internet services that we're going to talk about in the next couple nuggets. Okay, so to get Pro FTPD up and running, the first thing you have to do is install this from source code. Okay, I have already done the installation, so I'm just going to show you the set of commands that I did. And we've already talked about installing software from source code anyway, so I'll just give you a quick little refresher here. So what you do first is you unpack the tarball there, you uncompress that. Then you would go down into the Pro FTPD directory that's been created. In there, you would do a configure. You would run the configure script, run it with a prefix option, okay, that gives the location of where you want all this stuff to be stored. You might want it in user local, maybe you want it under user something else, whatever. I don't know where you want this, so that's up to you. I like to put these kinds of things into user local. All right, so once you run the configure script with this prefix, then everything will be, set up so that that will be the directory tree that is talked about for all the executables and configuration files and so on. All right, so I've already done this command, so I'm not going to hit enter here. Once that is complete, that takes a few minutes, then you can do a make command. Okay, the make command will start the compilation process, and then make install will actually do the installation of the software so that the executables are installed and everything like that. All right, so those are the commands. You unpack the tarball, you configure, you make, and then you make install. So once you've done the make and the make install to get the Pro FTP program installed on your system, then what you can do is go over to the directory that you specified in that prefix directive for the configure script. And for me, that was user local FTPD. So when I go over there and I do an ls, you'll see a handful of subdirectories. And these subdirectories contain the executable, the configuration files, things like that for the Pro FTP program. All right, so guess what's in the Etsy directory here? Well, there's the proftpd.conf configuration file, if you couldn't guess. Now let's take a look at that configuration file, and we'll look at some of the important aspects of this configuration file, what should be set, and so on. So here's server name, it just says proftpd default installation. Server type is important that it says standalone, okay? Remember that we're going to set this up as a standalone server first. The port should be 21 by default. The UMask should be 022. Everything else should be pretty much pretty standard. Make sure that your user and group settings are both set to a user and a group respectively that exist on your system. Okay, so the user here is nobody and the group is nobody. So the server is going to run under this, nobody user and group, because that way the server isn't running with like root privileges or something. All right, so you don't want, so you just want to make sure that this says nobody and nobody, or whatever it is on your system. Some systems this is no user, and some systems this is no group. Okay, so for me, it said nobody and no group, but on my system, no group wasn't there, so I just changed it over to the nobody group. Okay, it's a little confusing. Just look in Etsy password and look in Etsy group to see, what those names are for your particular system. Like I said, some systems it says no user, no group. Other systems it's nobody, like it is on my Red Hat system here. All right, so that's all I want to look at for the configuration file at this point. Once you make those changes, then go out and save your changes, and then what you can do is actually run the proftp program, okay, in standalone mode. So let's go back up a level here, go down into the sbin directory, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute the proftpd command that lies in here. I do that by typing /proftpd. I hit enter, and now it's running. Let's make sure that we know that it's running by actually looking for the file in the process tree. And so there it is, proftpd is running. There's the process number, and you can see here that it says accepting connections. All right, so now that we've done that, now let's look at how we can get on this FTP server from our local machine here. Well, now let's open up another shell window here where I'm logged in as the normal user Perry, and what I'm going to do is use an FTP client, just like the FTP program itself, and just say FTP 127.0.0.1. Remember that this is the internet address that refers to your local machine. So this is saying FTP to the local machine where I just set up the FTP server. So you can see here it says the proftpd 1.2.10 servers there, and it's requiring that I type in a name to log in. We have not set up anonymous logins yet, so we are going to have to supply a username and a password to get on the system. You can also see that it's defaulted to Perry because it's written that there because that's the name that I was logged in as anyway. So I can just hit enter. It says password required for Perry. I type in my password, and now I'm logged on to the FTP server that we just started up. All right, so now I can do whatever I do on FTP, all right? Like the other last nugget it was, we talked about the FTP client. I showed you the help screen. There's all the different commands you can run. One of the commands we can run is ls. You can see the files in my home directory. Notice that I am in the /home/Perry directory. Okay, so when I logged in on this FTP server, it directed me to home Perry. All right, and that's good because most of probably what I want to do is upload or download files from my home directory. That's one of the uses of FTP. All right, is that I would be able to transfer files, and one of the places that it makes sense for me to transfer files to and from is my home directory. But that being said, it's not restricting my access. I can go up to the Etsy directory, for instance, do an ls there. I can even get a file. I can get the zinetd.conf configuration file because it's readable by me. Okay, I get that file, I go back to the home Perry directory, I look in the home Perry directory now, and there's the zinetd configuration file that I just grabbed from the Etsy directory. All right, I can go up to the /home directory, I can do an ls, I can see all the different accounts that are on the system. All right, so all these kinds of things, might be viewed as security problems, right? That I don't want people to necessarily, just because they have FTP access to this machine, I don't want them to be able to necessarily like look at all these different files and so on. Okay, so that being said, the next thing that I want to do here is I want to show you how to restrict access so that when a user logs in, they are sent to their home directory, but that's the only place that they'll be allowed to operate. They will only be allowed to, upload and download files from within their home directory. They won't even be able to look at other people's files or other directories on the system, even if they normally could at other times. All right. And then the other thing we're going to do is look at how to allow anonymous logins. And both of those things can be, are just simple changes within the configuration file that we already looked at. Well, now here we are back in the FTPD directory. Let's go down into the etc directory, which is where that configuration file lies, and let's edit that configuration file. And the first thing that we want to do here is we want to restrict each user so that they can't look at anything but their home directory. And you can see here, there's actually a directive in this configuration file already for this. All we have to do is comment it out. So it says to cause every FTP user to be jailed, that's the, the loose term for it, into their home directory, uncomment this line. So all I'm going to do here is just take out that hash, and then now it says default root is tilde. And remember, tilde is the shortcut name for your home directory. What's actually going on behind the scenes here is that a change root command is happening. So that, remember, the chroot command is something that changes your root directory for this login session to be something other than the slash directory, okay, the actual root directory. So here it's saying make /home/Perry my root directory. So if I try to go anywhere else in the file system, like to /etc or to /home/doc or whatever, then I won't be able to go there, because in some sense those directories don't even exist for this login session that I have, because I've been change rooted to my home directory. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save my changes, and then what I have to do is I have to restart the server. So one way to do that is to say kill all -hup pro FTPD. Okay, so I do that. Now the FTPD server has been stopped and restarted, and every time it restarts, it rereads this configuration file. So if you make a change to the configuration file, you have to restart the FTPD server. Otherwise, your changes are not going to be reflected. Okay, now let's go back to the Perry side of things over here. Let's clear the screen. Let's go back and do another FTP 127.0.0.1. We're going to log on again, just like before, type in the password, and now you can see I'm back in my home directory. All right, let me just go up to /etc there. Okay, it says there is no /etc file. What are you talking about? There's no /etc file. I know there is. Bin. There's no bin file. How come it's not there? Because I've been change rooted to my home directory. So that's how you, what they call jail a user into just looking in their home directory. So when I log into the system, all that I have access to is my home directory and everything below it. I'm allowed to go into directories below this, like my miscellaneous directory or my programs directory, but I can't go any higher than /home/Perry. All right, well, we're back in the etc directory here with the proftpd.conf configuration file. Let's take a look at this configuration file again and look at what we need to do to allow anonymous access. Okay, so there's already a template here for allowing anonymous access on your directory. Okay, and there's some alterations that we can make in here, so that you can change things. This is very similar to HTML code, or like I was saying before, like the Apache configuration file, in that there are sections of the configuration file, and the way that you start up a section is you use one of these brackets, then one of the key names like anonymous, and then at the end of the section down here you'll see a corresponding brackets with a /anonymous. Okay, so that's the end of the anonymous section. So everything in here, all the settings that we make in here, have to do with anonymous FTP access. Now the first thing here is this little directive right here, the ~FTP. That's inside of these brackets, and what that's doing is that's setting up the default home directory for anonymous logins. Actually, when you're logging in as an anonymous user, what you're actually doing is you're logging in as the user FTP in the group FTP, which has very limited access. On my Red Hat machine here, FTP and the group FTP were there by default. That's true on a lot of versions of Linux. SUSE Linux, all the versions of Linux that I'm aware of, FTP, the user and the group, are both created by default. Now, where the tilde FTP directory is, that changes a little bit from system to system. Sometimes that's /var/FTP, which is what it is on the Red Hat system. It can be anything you want, actually. If you want to make it /home/FTP, you can do that. And you can write that directory path right here where you want anonymous logins to be directed to. And actually what's going to happen here is we're going to do the same thing as before with jailing the users. They're going to be jailed into that directory, okay? So they won't be able to go all over the system. All right, so now that we've gotten that straight where the home directory is, you can see here there's been an alias set up for us so that when someone does type the word anonymous, they're actually being logged in as the user FTP. And the reason that we want to set this alias up is just because anonymous is so standardized across the internet as a form of logins for FTP servers. All right, now this is limiting the max number of logins, anonymous logins we can have. There's little welcome messages that we can display. And then something else that's important down here is limiting the rights of anonymous users. Okay, so we're saying limit right, deny all /limit. So this little section of code here, what that says is do not allow anonymous users to write anywhere within the /var/FTP directories. Okay, because if we did allow them to write, they could overwrite files and remove stuff basically that we've put there for other people to get. All right, and then like I said before, there's the /anonymous directive. So that's the end of the anonymous section here. So I'm going to escape colon WQ to save my changes. Then we'll come out here, we'll do a kill all -hup pro FTPD. Remember, we have to do that to restart the server, to reread the configuration file. Let's go over again to the Perry user. So now we're going to say FTP 127.0.0.1, and now we're going to log in as anonymous. Okay, so it says it's okay, send your email as your password. I'll just type in my email address. And now I am in the anonymous directory, okay, /var/FTP. Notice there's nothing here but a pub directory. If I go down into that pub directory, there's one file that I've put in there called sample.txt. Okay, so this file sample.txt is there. I can read it. I can get that file, and that's how anonymous logins work. Notice that I can't do things like go to /Etsy. Okay, there is no /Etsy. I can't go to /home/Perry. Okay, there's no such file as or directory because again I've been jailed into the FTP user's home directory, which in this case is /var/FTP. Now let's look at the changes that we need to make to get the Pro FTP server running through ZynetD, the Internet Super Server. So the big picture here is that ZynetD will be sort of handling all of this stuff. The FTP server won't be running all the time, but when a request comes in over port 21, then we'll make it so that the ZynetD Super Server starts up the FTP server. The FTP server can do its thing, and then when the person quits out of using that and nobody else is logged in to use it, then ZynetD will basically shut it down, but it'll still be listening on port 21, so when the next request comes in on port 21, it'll start it up to satisfy it. So a system that has a lot of different kinds of servers on it, but maybe not a lot of traffic on those servers, this is a good way to handle that, because then all the services are there and available, but they're not running, they're not resident in memory, eating up memory, things like that. Okay, so a good place to start here is with the zynetd.configuration file. Okay, so we look at zynetd.conf. This is the entire configuration file here. One of the things to notice in here is that there's an include directory etc zynetd.d. So basically, the only thing in here is some real basic set of defaults. There's two different ways to configure this configuration file, though. Each service that you want to run within ZynetD can have an entry in zynetd.conf. The alternative is that each service that you want to have ZynetD run, you put a file into the zynetd.d directory, that subdirectory of etc. And then within that directory, there's all these different files that, explain the configuration for their particular service. Okay, so I'm going to quit out of here, and then let's go into the zynetd.d directory, do a listing in there, and there's all sorts of files in here. Each one represents a service that ZynetD can run. Now, some of these services can be turned off within these configuration files, but here's the service for my Pro FTP server, and this is something that I've got from a web page out there. I looked up, said sample Pro FTPD ZynetD configuration file, and this is what came up. And so if we look at this file, then you'll see that there's a few things in here. At the top, it needs to say service FTP. All right, and then there's these directives here. All right, now some of these directives are not necessary, like server args minus D5. That's a debugging directive. So if you're trying to debug something that's going wrong with your server, you need to put that in. If you don't want any debugging information to get logged, you can take that out of there. Okay, disable definitely needs to be equal to no. Socket type net definitely needs to be equal to stream. Wait definitely needs to be equal to no. Server needs to be the path to the server that you've configured. User equals root, and then the kind of stuff that you're recording on successes and failures to the FTP server. Okay, so it's saying for successes, log the host and the process identification number. On failures, log the host and the record information, and it'll give some information about what went wrong. Okay, so that file needs to be in place in the etc zynetd.d directory, and I'm calling it proftpd. The key there is that at the top of that file it said service space FTP, and that corresponded to the FTP service which runs on port 21 and so on. All right, let's also look at the configuration file that's in the ftpd etc directory, namely the proftpd.conf configuration file. Now, in this configuration file, what you need to do is you need to change the server type. This used to stay standalone when we were doing a standalone server. Now that we're running it from within ZynetD, now we put the server type as inetd. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether you're running it at ZynetD or in inetd, the old internet super daemon. The name for the server type is just inetd. Also in here, I put this directive system log, var log, ftp log. This is another directive that you can put in place if you're trying to do debugging information. If you're trying to get information something's not working on your server, that's how you can specify what log it should be placed in when that debugging information comes up. Okay, so that's the changes that you need to make. We'll quit out of here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to restart. Once those changes are done, now I want to restart the ZynetD server. And the way that I do that is I type etc init.d ZynetD and restart. Now, from one version of Linux to another, this could be slightly different. Like it could be etc rc.d, init.d, something like that. But somewhere in there, there will be a script for ZynetD. The options are, start and stop and restart. So you can see there, it stopped ZynetD, it started ZynetD up. Let me go over to my other window here. Let me get back to being the user Perry in this window. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say FTP 127.0.0.1. And here we go. We're back to being able to log in. And now that service was running through ZynetD, but it works exactly the same way as if it was running as a standalone application. The user Perry that logs in here, the anonymous user that logs in, has no idea whether it's running as a inside of ZynetD or as a standalone server. So basically that's the steps to get something to run within ZynetD. It's as easy as that. So if you wanted to do something like the telnet server, what you need to do is you would need to get a telnet file that is a configuration file that would live in this ZynetD.d directory. So if you search for telnet and ZynetD, you would see examples on the internet for that particular file. You would put that file into the ZynetD.d directory, and then there's probably like a telnet.conf configuration file that you'd have to alter, just like we altered the proftpd.conf configuration file for this particular setup. Okay, always remember to stop and restart the ZynetD server so that the configuration files are reread after you make changes to them, things like that. Okay, so that's all there is to it to get something to run within the Internet Super Server. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our first nugget on network services. We'll continue talking about network services in the next nugget by looking at programs like the SendMail program. But in this nugget, we focused on the FTP program. We learned how to get an FTP server up and running. The FTP server that we chose to get up and running here was Pro FTPD. Another good choice would be VSFTPD, the very secure file transfer protocol daemon. Okay, so that's the one that we chose. I showed you quickly how to install that from source code and so on. One of the important configuration files was the proftpd.conf configuration file. This is in this configuration file. This is where you could do things like jail users, we called it, so that when users logged in, they couldn't get out and look around all over the system. That's especially important if you're allowing anonymous FTP access. You don't want some random user to be able to come on your system and look all over your system. So we learned how to jail users. We also learned how to allow anonymous FTP logins, things like that. So that's the kind of stuff that gets configured in the proftpd.conf configuration file. Remember that any changes to this file require that you stop and restart the proftpd server. If you're running it in standalone mode, you need to shut that down and restart it so that the configuration file is reread. Then we learned about the internet super server called ZynetD. So in the big picture, this thing can run a lot of different services. The only service that we explicitly set up in ZynetD in this nugget was the FTP service. Okay, but the ZynetD super server is configured through the zynetd.conf configuration file. In there, there's probably an include statement that says include etc zynetd.d, and in that particular directory is where we created that file called pro FTPD, and in that file we set up some of the options to run the FTP service from within ZynetD. We had to say like what kind of socket type it was, and whether where the executable was for this thing, the kinds of flags we wanted to pass to the executable code, and so on. Okay, remember that anytime you make changes to these files here, you need to stop and restart the ZynetD super server. Okay, and you do that on this particular Red Hat machine by saying etc init.d zynetd space restart. That will stop the server, restart the server, and all the configuration changes that we made, for example, to this proftpd configuration file will then be reflected, and that's how you get everything running. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.